Jai Nitya Lila Pravishta Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivraj Acharya Stotra Shada Shri Srimad Bhaya Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Nitya Lila Pravishta Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivraj Acharya Ashtotra Shada Shri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Jai Nitya Lila Pravishta Om Vishnupada Srila Gorkishore Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai Nitya Lila Pravishta Om Vishnupada Srila Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur Ki Jai Nitya Lila Pravishta Om Vishnupada Vaishnava Sarvabhaum Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai Shri Gauriya Vaishnav Guru Varga Ki Jai Ganga Mai Ki Jai Jamuna Mai Ki Jai Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Tulsi Devi Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Jai Nitai Gaura Premanande, Hari Hari Bo, all glory assembled devotees, Hare Krishna, all glory assembled devotees, Hare Krishna, all glory assembled devotees, Hare Krishna, all glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, reading today from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 15, Text 13. Ta ekada bhagavato Vaikuntasya malatmanaha Yayur Vaikuntha nilayam Sarvaloka namaskritam ta ekada bhagavato Vaikunthasya malatmanaha Yayur Vaikuntha nilayam Sarvaloka namaskritam Ta ekada bhagavato Vaikunthasya malatmanaha Yayur Vaikuntha nilayam Sarvaloka namaskritam Ta ekada bhagavato Vaikunthasya malatmanaha Yayur Vaikuntha nilayam Sarvaloka namaskritam Ta ekada bhagavato Vaikunthasya malatmanaha Yayur Vaikuntha nilayam Sarvaloka namaskritam Ta ekada bhagavato Vaikunthasya malatmanaha Yayur Vaikuntha nilayam Sarvaloka namaskritam They ekada once upon a time Bhagavataha of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vaikunthasya of Lord Vishnu Amala Atmanaha being freed from all material contamination Yayuhu entered Vaikuntha Nilayam, the abode named Viconta, Sarva Loka, by the residents of all the material planets. Namaskritam, worshipped. Translation. After thus traveling all over the universes, they also entered into the spiritual sky, for they were freed from all material contamination. In the spiritual sky there are spiritual planets known as Vikuntas, which are the residents of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his pure devotees, and are worshipped by the residents of all the material planets. Purport. The material world is full of cares and anxieties. In any one of the planets, beginning from the highest down to the lowest, Patala, every living creature must be full of cares and anxieties, because in the material planets one cannot live eternally. The living entities, however, are actually eternal. They want an eternal home, an eternal residence, but because of accepting a temporal abode in the material world, they are naturally full of anxiety. In the spiritual sky, the planets are called Vikunta, because the residents of these planets are free from all anxieties. For them, there is no question of birth, death, old age, and diseases, and therefore they are not anxious. On the other hand, the residents of the material planets are always afraid of birth, death, disease, and old age, and therefore they are full of anxieties. And again, the translation. After thus traveling all over the universes, they also entered into the spiritual sky, for they were freed from all material contamination. In the spiritual sky there are spiritual planets known as Vikuntas, which are the residents of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his pure devotees, and are worshipped by the residents of all the material planets. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupah Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guroho Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam tam sajivam sadvaitam savadhutam parijana sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gora Tushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So today we are continuing our reading of this section of the third canto. We're hearing about the four Kumaras and their transcendental feats, we could say. The four Kumaras are very interesting figures. And they are, of course, as is mentioned here, freed from all material contamination. And so they've been touring around the transcendental Viconta planets, and Prabhupada has been stressing the nature of the material world in comparison to it. And we see that this is the nature of the material world. Anytime anything bad happens, well, we're always, in anywhere, people are always full of anxiety. If you turn on the news, you'll see it's a constant feed of earthquake here, attack there, this person here has died, that person there has died. I still remember in Port Macquarie, where I grew up, it was a small town, right? So one person got stabbed, I think, 10 years ago, and we still talk about it. We say, this is the place where that person got stabbed, right? Of course, in Sydney, that's like a twice a day occurrence, but in certain parts at least. But in Port Macquarie, that was the really, really big news for us. So it became a big part of our identity, right? But everyone is full of anxieties with all of these things. And we can see this also with marketing. They found one of the most effective forms of marketing. Of course, normally we think about, hopefully we don't think about it, but we know about how it's normally lust that's used, right? They'll have all sorts of people, scantily clad and everything in order to promote things. But what they found is that also equally effective is fear, right? And so in marketing, they'll generate all sorts of fears. So many people, I still remember I was at university once and somebody pulled out a phone and they're like, yeah, no, I'm sorry, I know it's an old one. And there was that fear that, oh, look, here I have something that's old and out of date. It can still call people. I mean, it can do a whole lot more than call people. And that's all you need from a phone. But there's this fear that gets generated, right? If I don't have the newest thing, well then, may Krishna have mercy on my soul. I'm gone. If I don't have the iPhone XYZ or whatever the latest one is, then, I may as well be in the hellish planets, right? That's the fear that gets generated. And so because of this, we find that this is the nature of the world. Everyone is perpetually filled with anxieties and fears. What will go wrong next? This is the industry. Now we have 24/7 news. You'll find TV channels that you can pay for, and you get 24/7 news. And what is the news? It's just constantly feeding all of these anxieties, right? And we find that even in devotional circles. This is something that I was thinking during the COVID times, which we still technically are in, but everyone's just sort of mutually decided to ignore now. So I was thinking about that because, of course, I'm not saying we should take care of our health and we should take care of the health of the devotees, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying anything like that. But you saw devotees would obsess over every detail, this vaccine is good, this vaccine is bad, etc., etc. They would say, look at this story, oh no, look, this thing here, this thing there. And people, and I'm not making a comment on either side of any controversy, but I'm saying the fact that devotees got so obsessed into it is just pure prajalpa, right? It's purely playing into material anxieties. We should do the needful and then keep on going speaking about Krishna. But there was quite a long period where no matter who you talked to, devotee or not, all you would hear about is COVID Katha, right? And the wonderful qualities of Sri Srimad COVID-19, right? So that became a real issue for a while. So this is the nature of the world, because of course we're in it, and that tendency to enter into that anxiety, it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. But then of course, what do we hear? Viconta is the opposite. Interestingly enough, Srila Prabhupada, what does he say here? He says, we are all in anxiety because one cannot live eternally. Which is interesting, because in the Bhagavad Gita, what do we hear? We hear that we are very much eternal, right? We hear that not myself, not you, nor any of the kings on this battlefield have ever come into existence, nor are we coming into existence, nor will we ever leave, right? We hear all of these things in the first half of the second chapter. And so we hear all of this, and yet we're hearing that one cannot live eternally. Of course, what is meant by this is that one's identification with their body cannot live eternally. And that's why universally, in every culture, it's a great anxiety, right? Even in the Rig Veda, you can find this one section where there's almost like this existential expression. And whichever rishi had composed that part, he says, is this all there is? I am born and then I will die, right? And this is the universal problem, if you will. In every culture, there's all sorts of ideas. How will I be able to preserve my life? Because it's a very natural instinct. And why is it a natural instinct? Because it's not based on any dogma. It's not based on any concern. It's based on the central anxiety of our material condition. You'll see the ancient Egyptians, the way they got buried, they would be buried with all these special items to help them in the afterlife, right? To help them along the way their life would continue. We see the ancient Jews. If you read the really, really early parts of the Bible, they don't actually have any afterlife. They just say he went to rest with his fathers, which quite literally meant he was buried. But this was too anxious. And you can see then they start developing this real anxiety over it. And if you actually read it without any previous assumptions, you'll see they're developing all of these ideas. Oh, the good will go here and the bad will go there, like that. All of these ideas develop, right? So the concern about what happens after death, is there anything after death, is very central. And why is it central? Because, of course, what is the nature of the spirit soul? It's a tiny, tiny little spark of Satchidananda, right? It's a tiny little spark that is made for eternity, right? Jiver Shurupoya Krishna Nityadas, right? We're made for an eternal existence. And yet, when the jiva so intelligently identifies with the body, there is no eternity, right? There is an eternity, but it is one that the conditioned soul turns away from. It is so therefore, if one understands their identity to be the soul, this anxiety is not there. Mukunda Maharaj, he talks about when Srila Prabhupada was in San Francisco, I think. Is that the place in America where they have lots of earthquakes? There's some place in America which is on a tectonic plate, so they have earthquakes all the time. And so Srila Prabhupada, he was visiting there, and he was in the room with Srila Prabhupada, and he was serving him. Suddenly there was an earthquake, and it was a really bad one, and the whole room was shaking. Mukunda Maharaj, he was saying he was panicking, he was thinking, what if the building topples over? And Srila Prabhupada was just continuing to just read, right? Because there's that realization, right? Because when one identifies with the body, then the world is an ocean of anxieties, right? If I lose my finger, I'm not getting it back again. If I lose my arm, I'm not getting it back again. And if I lose the whole body, I'm definitely not getting it back again, right? But when one identifies with the soul, one realizes there is no need for anxiety. Because who can take away my soul, which is what I am, right? Which is eternal. So therefore, this world is a place of anxieties, not because the material worlds themselves are bad. This material world is perfect. We find this in the Ishopanishad, right? Om Purnam Madaha Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Udachyate, right? We find this. The Baladevi Vibhushan, he renders this as talking about Vishnu and his avatars. So he says that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he is complete. And yet coming out from him are all these complete emanations. But Srila Prabhupada, he renders it in a different way, right? Because of course, especially the Shruti literature, especially the Upanishads, they're so... Like if you just look at it grammatically, it makes no sense. I still remember when I was doing Sanskrit at university, we looked at this text in the Ishopanishad. And we read it out and we did the grammatical analysis and everything quite literally. And then I still remember after we all finished, we all had to do it in the class and the teacher said in 5 minutes we'll come back. And I still remember hearing next to me, the student, he finished translating. He said, "What does this mean?" That was his whole lamentation. And then at the end we had this big discussion about what possibly could it mean, and then all this Mayavad was thrown around and my ears wanted to fall off, but what to do? But anyway, so because of this, because the Upanishads, what does it mean? Upanishad means to come near and listen, right? And so the Upanishads are traditionally a little bit difficult to understand because they're meant to be unpacked by acharyas, by gurus, like that, right? So they're intentionally rather difficult. That's why we don't study so many Upanishads, right? We study the Ishopanishad and that's about it, right? Maybe Kenopanishad or something. But in general, we don't study them so much as Smriti Shastras, which are meant to be for a little bit more obvious in their meaning. Anyways, so that's the way to understand why there's all these differing explanations, especially with the Upanishads, because there's so much meaning that's packed into these texts. They're intentionally vague so that all these levels of meaning can be pulled out. Anyways, so Srila Prabhupada, he renders that as saying this material world is complete. It is full, right? It is not this material world, actually, that is a place of suffering. It is our identification with it that is making all the suffering, right? It is the way we approach the material world that causes it to be a place of suffering, right? Sometimes people will say, especially my Christian friends, this is their big thing. They say, "Oh, you Vedic guys, you're so negative, You're always telling about how bad this world is. This world is a terrible place." What sort of guy is God if he creates such a terrible place for you to be in, right? That's what they'll say. But actually, this world is a perfect place, right? It's emanating from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, right? And, Mahamaya, sometimes we speak heavily about her, but actually sometimes we're a bit too harsh, She's just doing her job, right? Really, the only culprit here are the spirit souls, right? Who see this world and use it for the incorrect purpose, right? You can have the most perfect surfboard in the world, but if you try and make a cheese sandwich out of it, it's going to be terrible, right? It's not going to do the job. So why is Srila Prabhupada saying this material planet is a terrible place? Because we are full of anxiety, because in this planet one cannot live eternally, right? And whose fault is that? It is the fault of the spirit souls, not even the fault of the material world. Because what do we see when the pure devotees come along, right? They use this world perfectly, right? Can we say that Srila Prabhupada is generating a world of anxieties when he's engaging with the material world? I don't think so, right? So by properly engaging the material world also becomes perfect. That's what we hear in Chaitanya Charitamrita. At the time of initiation, one's body becomes spiritual, right? At that moment. And not the Siddha Deha, the eternal form of the spiritual world, but the Sadhak Deha, right? The body in which one is practicing spiritual life. It becomes spiritualized. Because then it is made perfect. And then it is acknowledged and used for the purpose that everything is made for, which is, of course, the service of the Supreme Lord. So this world is not actually, in one sense, a very terrible place, right? It's terrible for the purposes of the rebellious spirit souls. But the unfortunate thing is there's no place that is good for the rebellious spirit souls, right? So we hear all of this. And therefore, when many people start thinking about how they want to end their suffering, they see this world and they think, well, what's the opposite of this world? And then they think, well, there's nothingness, right? There is nothingness, zero, zilch. And that is ideal because I'm surrounded in this world of form and varieties. So often, I'm sure we've all talked to like some Mayavadi who comes in to the temple and you'll speak to him and he'll say, oh, this is all very good, but I am Krishna and you are Shiva or something like that, right? And we'll hear all that. And when you boil it down, every single time, at least in my experience, you'll find that their whole anxiety is, I don't like the dualities of this world. Whenever I become happy, I become sad again, right? This is, as we know, key to Bhagavad Gita, matra sparshastu kanteya, right? It's like a cycle, like the winter and summer seasons. So because they see all the variety in this world, they think, well, if I see variety in this world, and I suffer so much, then clearly the ideal world is a world without variety, right? And it logically makes sense. Because what's higher than -10? 0, right? 0 is higher than -10. But what is the aspiration of the devotee and what is the aspiration of the Vedic literature? We are wondering, are there actually positive numbers, right? Are there numbers beyond 0? Are there numbers that exist beyond 0? And of course, we are finding here that there very much are numbers beyond 0. And those are the Viconta planets. And the Viconta planets are variegated in many different ways. They are not just variegated in the sense of having form. There is a lot of variety in them. I remember I was listening to one podcast with this one devotee scholar, a devotee academic, and he was getting interviewed because he'd just done a translation of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And he'd written, it's actually very, very good preaching because the whole commentary, even though it's very academic, is completely pushing this strong Vaishnava interpretation of the Yoga Sutras. And because he produced such a high-quality translation, it's now like the standard one in academic settings. So you have all of these scholars and all of these yoga studios, and without knowing it, they're reading this text, which in the whole commentary is just telling you to become a devotee, right? He takes all of the texts and says this is actually about meditating on the Supreme Lord. All of these things. Anyway, so he was on this interview, and this one person was saying, oh yeah, it's all the same, At the end of the day, no matter what you do, it's all the same. We're all worshipping the one impersonal Brahman, aren't we, right? And you could feel that, because of course he came into contact with devotional service through Srila Prabhupada's books. Actually, he wrote the Penguin Classics. They did an edition of the Bhagavatam. And so he wrote their translation for them. And at the beginning, he wrote dedicated to His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Which is very nice to think that we have that. Penguin Books now has got some Sukriti. We'll see. Because, of course, corporations are considered persons in Australian law. So we'll see when Penguin Books takes their next birth, whether they'll get the benefit of all of that Sukriti. They're glorifying Srila Prabhupada, at least in a few thousand copies of how they've printed that book. But anyway, so you could see that mood of Srila Prabhupada came out. Suddenly he got very angry, which is not very common for academics to do. Normally they have to pretend like they're very sober people, even though they're definitely not, right? And he got very angry, and he said, maybe we can actually acknowledge the destination that people wish to attain is actually the destination they attain. Maybe we can say that when a person says, I love Ramchandra, they're not going to be cheated out of it in spiritual life. Maybe when somebody says, I love Krishna, they will not be cheated out of it in spiritual life, right? Maybe we can say that maybe everyone isn't deluded and we are this some sort of privileged section of people who actually knows who people are worshipping, right? Maybe we can say there is a legitimacy to it. Because this is the issue. Sometimes people are attracted to the ideas of impersonalism because they think this is the universal philosophy, right? This way I can say all religions are true, right? Because we're all just worshipping this impersonal oneness and we're all putting our own forms onto it. And it seems very open-minded and it seems very progressive and it seems very wonderful. But actually it's the most dogmatic of all of them. Because at the very least, even the fundamentalist will say, my religion is true. But the Mayavadi says no religion is true. The Mayavadi says, actually none of this is true. All of it is nonsense. At least the sectarian fundamentalist can say one religion is true. But what does the Mayavadi do? In their attempts to be very broad-minded, they reject all religions. They do not accept all of them. They're engaged in an intense rejection of all of them. So therefore, even by their own standard, the Mayavad philosophy, it fails. But that is not the standard of our philosophy. We believe in a very variegated philosophy. We see this in the pastimes of Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? When Mahaprabhu was traveling on a South India tour, why does he go to South India? Yes, but what's the reason he gives? He gives a reason, he gives a justification. To find his brother. And there's a special reason why. Because, of course, in Navadvip, they're all very attached to Mahaprabhu. We all know how they acted even when he shaved his head, right? When he took sannyas. Virtually the exact same descriptions we hear that all of the Vrajvasis have when Krishna leaves Vrindavan. You can read Jagannath Mishra, Sachi Devi. They're all just completely... in the incredible depths of separation, right? So they're very, very much attached. And if Mahaprabhu were to say, actually if you can say there's three reasons. Actually his brother had already passed away, right? So we can say that's not really a reason, right? The two reasons are, there's the internal and external. We find this with Mahaprabhu's pastimes. We know there's the internal and external reasons for his advent, right? So the internal and external, they come up all the time. Every single time Mahaprabhu does something, he's trying to fulfill the internal purpose and the external purpose, right? So, in order to go to South India, his external purpose is, yes, to reap all the souls of South India and bring them into Krishna consciousness. The internal purpose is because he wants to meet Ramananda Rai, right? And have deeper instructions into his, very esoteric moods. And of course, when we read Chaitanya Charitamrita, we see that. It almost feels like whiplash when we read the Rai Ramananda Samvad, right? At the beginning, we're talking about Varnashram, and at the end, it's like, am I even allowed to read this, So Mahaprabhu, he's going because why? He wants to receive these instructions, right? But what reason does he give? And of course, I don't want to tangent into Mahaprabhu Leela, but the reason why he has to take it from Ramananda Rai is because Ramananda Rai is an incarnation of Vishaka. Right? And what do we know? What time? What is the appearance day of Vishaka? Do we know? Yes. Vishakashtami is Radhashtami, right? So that's why Prabhupada, sometimes in Gorgana Desha Deepika, Ramananda Rai, he's identified with Lalita. But Srila Prabhupada, he writes in the purport that actually is Vishaka, right? Sometimes he writes the other way around. But in the context of the Rai Ramananda Samvad, he identifies with Vishaka. And the reason why is because Lalita and Vishaka, they're the closest friends, right, of Srimati Radharani, right? But Lalita, she's a little bit older, right? So when all of the elevated pastimes happen, Lalita, she acts like an older sister almost to Srimati Radharani. So she doesn't fully have the mood. But Vishaka, born at the same moment and everything, Vishaka also can mean a branch. So sometimes it's said she's like a branch of Srimati Radharani. So that's why Mahaprabhu goes specifically. That's why he can't take the guidance from somebody in Navadvip. Yeah, anyways, a little tangential. But why does he give the reason of finding his brother, right? It's because in Navadvip, of course, they're so attached to Mahaprabhu, right? And we know, I was mentioning 2 weeks ago, in this world, what we see as Maya is just truth in the spiritual world, right? In this world, we say we're not this body. In the spiritual world, everyone is their body, right? So in the same way, these attachments that we see, and which causes so much suffering, as the point I was making, which an impersonalist would want to quench away, is replaced in the spiritual domain, right? So what is the relationship of all the associates of Mahaprabhu in Navadvip? It's complete familial attachment, right? So if Mahaprabhu were to say, I have to preach the glorious mission of the Sankirtan movement, they will say, stop being a fanatic, you know? Stop being so fanatic, right? Stay home, let us feed you, right? So Mahaprabhu, he has to say, I'm going to find my brother, because that they can understand. They can say, oh yes, of course, you know, we miss him too, right? And so because of this reason, Mahaprabhu, he says, okay, I'm looking for my brother. I'm going to get my brother. And then they all say, oh, we can accept this, right? Again, this is the elevated nature of the devotee, right? But what happens when he's traveling throughout that area, right? He's running into all of these devotees, right? And many of them, he brings that highest conception of Krishna consciousness to. Again, 2 weeks ago I was talking about Viconta Bhatta, right? He is a very ardent devotee of Lakshmi Narayan. And yet, he refutes his conceptions, again, through joking, right? And of course, Mayavadis, Mahaprabhu, he's, smashing and smashing through all special ways, right? But we'll find something interesting. Because Mahaprabhu, when he finds elevated devotees at a higher level of realization, right? When he finds them, he doesn't do anything but glorify them, right? What happens when he meets Ramdas Vipra, right? We know Ramdas Vipra, he's sitting there and he invites Mahaprabhu to take prasad. And then Mahaprabhu says, in order to have prasad, we need bhoga, What's going on here, right? And then he says, Lakshman, he will return soon, right? So deeply absorbed he is in this meditation, right? And so Mahaprabhu, what does he say? Does he say, well, actually, Lakshman, he is the expansion of Balaram? No. He acknowledges this mood, right? And then what happens? Of course, we know Ramdas Vipra, he says, how can we eat? Sita, she has been kidnapped, right? And what does Mahaprabhu say? Does Mahaprabhu say, it is good to meditate on Ram's pastimes, but in Srimad Bhagavatam there's only 2 chapters that talk about Ramchandra. Better to meditate about Krishna, huh? Does Mahaprabhu say this? No, right? He consoles him in his mood and he says, of course, how can Sita be kidnapped, right? How could a demon like Ravana have put his hands on her, right? It is just a Mayic copy, right? We actually hear the same thing in Brahma Vimohan Lila. When Brahma, he takes the gopas, he doesn't actually take the gopas. It's the same thing. He takes these shadowy sort of Maya copies. And Yoga Maya covers the original gopas. And then, of course, Krishna then expands out. So we have 3 sets of gopas at that point. So we see this, right? And of course, then Mahaprabhu, yesterday, of course, we were talking about Ramchandra, the Maryada Purush, right? And of course, we have Ramchandra's Maryada Purush, Krishna's Leela Purush, right? Purushottam, rather. And sometimes it's said Mahaprabhu is Prema Purushottam, right? But in many ways, Mahaprabhu is also Maryada Purushottam, right? How strictly he follows these rules and regulations, right? Therefore, nobody can actually accuse Krishna of being some person who has no control over his senses, right? Because he came as Mahaprabhu as well, right? And as Mahaprabhu, how strict he was in his. Anyways, so he's manifesting all of this. So what does he do? Exemplifying the rules and regulations, he then travels and he finds in Kurma Purana, he finds the pramana for what he's found, right? Because everything we do should be backed up with Shastra. There Mahaprabhu, he's proving that, right? But we see this, right? So what has Mahaprabhu done? He's seen this devotion and he's acknowledged it. We also hear this about Anupama, right? The brother of Rupa and Sanatana Goswamis, right? Because they make that vow, let us worship now Radha and Krishna, right? And then he says, how can I do this? I will be able to die before I'm able to give up my Lord Ramchandra. And what does Mahaprabhu say? Oh, you are stuck in an inferior conception? Does he say that? No. No, he says, how amazing, how glorious is the devotee who will not give up his Lord. And how glorious is that Lord who will not give up his devotee, right? So we see variety is a spice of life, right? And we see that it's also the spice of spiritual life. Of course, we are very fixed in our mood, hopefully, right? That we are very determined, right, to become devotees of Radha and Krishna, right? But the spiritual world, it is not lacking in variety. We are hearing about the Viconta planets, right? It is not that there is only Goloka Vrindavan, right? It is not that that is the only aspect of the spiritual domain. Everything is there, right? Ayodhya is there in the spiritual world. Navadvip is there in the spiritual world. Of course, there are some Sahajiyas who say that Navadvip does not exist in the spiritual world. But that's why they're Sahajiyas and not devotees in the correct line. Because how can it not be? Mahaprabhu is an eternal reality, and all eternal realities are reflections of the spiritual world, right? Mahaprabhu, he is worshipped. This was actually a debate in the early Vaishnava community, right? Not a debate, but when after Mahaprabhu left, everything sort of, it's the same thing after like Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. After he left, chaos, right? What's the chapter in Lilamrita? Fire in the mutt or something like that, right? Similar thing happened after Mahaprabhu left. Less fighting, but more that Mahaprabhu, as I just said, he's traveling everywhere and he's just creating devotees left, right, and center, right? Just complete pouring forth of Krishna Prem. So wherever he went, all of the relative moods had come up, right? So in Vrindavan, all of the Gauriya Vaishnavas, they were very interested in Sanskrit literature. They were very philosophical. It was very much oriented about Radha, Krishna, and this Sanskrit scholarship. In Bengal, it became very... lots of Bengali bhajans and Mahaprabhu biographies. That's why we see the longer biographies of Mahaprabhu are in Bengali, and the shorter ones are Sanskrit, right? So there's all of these slight, and all the community was starting to feel, at this point we're going to split up, right? There's going to be tension because all these different moods are arising. So they came across the Council of Keturi, right? And so all of the devotees at the time, and Janava Mata, she presided over it, right? And all the devotees came together and they discussed everything. And they resolved everything, right? This was how they resolved all of the debate. And one of the debates was the worship of the Murti worship, right? And so it was decided there that, of course, the worship of the Murti of Mahaprabhu is appropriate, right? But then we can say the question, we only worship Murti forms that exist in the spiritual world. Right? We do not worship other ones. So, simply by that logic, it has to be that there is a Nitya Navadvip, right? There is an eternal Navadvip in the spiritual world. And of course, Gaur Govinda Maharaj makes this point that in that Navadvip, Mahaprabhu, he's not shaven. He's no sannyas. He has his long hair, right? Because it's Navadvip, right? Jagannath Puri pastimes, they are like Krishna's pastimes in Dwarka almost, in the sense that they are also eternal. No, actually, they're not like those. They're like the killing of the demons. Sorry, right? In the sense that they happen in the Prakat Leela, not in the eternal Leelas. In Nitya Navadvip, it's Mahaprabhu having fun with everyone in Navadvip. Anyways, so coming back to the point, right? All of this diversity is there. All of it is there. There is so much diversity in the spiritual world, right? And that's why Mahaprabhu, right? He saw the Sthayi Bhav, he saw that it was there, and he acknowledged it. And we too acknowledge it then, right? So this is the nature of the spiritual world. It's filled with diversity, right? That's not to say that we can't say they are higher and lower. We're not some relativists, right? We find this in Brihad Bhagavatamrita. Narad Muni, he's traveling around and he runs into this Brahmin. And this Brahmin, he's giving nice charity, right? He's distributing nicely prasad and all. And Narad Muni, he says, wow, you're such an elevated personality. Look at you. And then this Brahmin, he says, what, are you teasing me? Go see Maharaj Indradyumna, right? There is a great personality, right? And off the top of my head, I've forgotten the exact order, but it goes up, like, then they go to like Indra. And then from Indra, they go to Brahma. And from Brahma, they go to Prahlad Maharaj. And from Prahlad Maharaj, they go to Hanuman, right? And each one of these times, the same thing happens. Narad Muni, he says, wow, you're such a great personality. And they say, surely, you can't say this about me, right? Devotion starts at Prahlad Maharaj when he's visiting all the people. But Prahlad Maharaj, like the four Kumaras, he's in Shantaras, right? I mean, you'll hear different descriptions, but at least in this narration, he's considered to be in Shantaras. And so he says, go meet Hanuman. And then, of course, Narad Muni, he's there. And we know he travels with his veena. And normally he's chanting what? Narayan, Narayan, right? But this time he's chanting Rama, Rama, right? And of course, it's actually described that Hanuman, when Narad Muni, he's flying through the air, Hanuman grabs him midair, right? He's so attracted at the holy name of Ramchandra. We know Hanuman, he's not half bad at jumping, right? So he jumps up into the sky and he grabs him midair and he embraces him. And he embraces him. He says, "Who is this wonderful personality who's so sweetly chanting the name of my Lord," right? But then he says, "Oh, you are thinking highly of my devotion. Go see Uddhav," right? And then, of course, we know then Narad Muni, he goes to Uddhav, right? And Uddhav, we know the very, very famous pastime. When Uddhav goes to Vrindavan, Uddhav, he's sort of, I wouldn't say he has some ego, because we can't say that out of a personality like Uddhav. But at least in the pastime, he almost has this conception, we are in Dwarka, right? We are living with Krishna all the time. We know him very well, right? And then he goes to Vrindavan, and what does he see, right? Beyond his conception, right? He's thinking, I forget about comparing myself to this. I do not even understand this, right? So we see there is a hierarchy, right? But it is not that the hierarchy is there so that we can, how do we put it? So that we say one person is higher or lower, right? That hierarchy is an objective understanding, right? But when one has a subjective experience of their bhav, of their rasa, of their mood, then that is not something to be disturbed. And that variety creates the variety of the spiritual world, right? So therefore, we have this very variegated and beautiful spiritual world, right? Which is populated by all sorts of individuals, right? And we know this is, of course, the purpose of Krishna, right? And so everyone, they sort of get all of their different locations based on their mood. We know even the demons, they get to go there, right? Not all the demons get Sayujya liberation, right? Some get a Sarupya. I think Aghasur gets Sarupya, right? Because when it's said that, after Aghasur gets killed, his jiva pops out and then it merges into Krishna, right? But actually it's said that it pops in and then it bounces out, right? That's what our acharyas say, right? Pops in and then it bounces out and then he gets a nicer destination than just merging into the Brahman effulgence, right? Actually, it's interesting. Baladev Vidyabhushan, he writes actually that the destination of the demons is normally Sayujya, because when Krishna kills someone, Krishna doesn't kill someone halfway, right? He kills you all the way, you know what I mean? Normally when we, not we kill someone as if we're regularly killing people, but normally when we, in the abstract sense, kill someone, right? We're just, killing their gross body and then their subtle body goes somewhere else, right? But Baladev Vidyabhushan writes, when Krishna kills someone, he destroys their material body and their subtle body. And aversion to Krishna, dislike of Krishna, is a material samskar. It's definitely not a spiritual samskar. So it has to be a material samskar, right? So because of that, with the material samskar gone, because he's destroyed everything, right? They have this one moment where they see Krishna, they have his darshan, and they don't have that filter of dislike, they don't have that filter of envy, they don't have that filter of hatred, and therefore they get liberation. The Baladev Vidyabhushan describes. So we see like this, Krishna, he's constantly filling up the spiritual world, right? And so we have all this wonderful variety, right? And this wonderful variety, again, Mahaprabhu, he's encouraging it. He's worshipping it. He's celebrating it. What do we find when Mahaprabhu, speaking of the South India tour, right before the Rai Ramananda Samvad, right? One of the most, as I said, like such a rasic, elevated conversation. Where does he go? Right before the Rai Ramananda Samvad happens. Which deity does he visit? Do you remember? Nrsingadev, right? And then what does he sing? Jai Nrsinga, Shri Nrsinga, Jai Jai Nrsingadev, Praladesha Jaya Padma, Mukha Padma Bringa. He didn't go in front of Nrsingadev and start reciting Gopi Gita, right? He was celebrating this. And Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he says the reason why is, why did Mahaprabhu come, right? Why did Mahaprabhu come? Well, for many reasons, right? We won't list them all. But one reason is because he wants to be Rasaraj, right? He wants to taste all of the rasas. He wants to celebrate all of them. Of course, the highest one is, of course, the rasa of Srimati Radharani, right? But he wants to celebrate all of them. He wants to taste all of them. So why does he go in front of Nrsingadev, right? Because he wants to taste that mood, the angry sort of mood, the love that the devotee has for that angry form of the Lord, right? So this is part of Mahaprabhu's mission. It's not a sidelined one, right? It's not a secondary one. Again, Mahaprabhu is doing it right before he goes to hear the Rai Ramananda Samvad. And of course, there's deeper meanings as well. I don't want to tangent again, but I'm just about to. We also hear this because Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he writes bhajans to Nrsingadev, right? And in these bhajans to Nrsingadev, he prays, please purify my heart of all the demonic tendencies so that I can worship Radha Krishna, right? So actually when Mahaprabhu does this, he's also signifying that we should be purified from all demonic tendencies before we enter into, like, again, the very, very elevated topics that Rai Ramananda Samvad include. But there is also, again, as I said, Srila Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he writes this, that Mahaprabhu, he is wanting to taste all these moods. So we see this full diversity of moods, right? But we shouldn't think that they are absent in Krishna's pastimes, right? Actually, everything is present in Krishna's pastimes. I think of this. We normally count the Purushottam forms. Who are they? Ramchandra, Mahaprabhu, and Krishna, right? And why are they the Purushottam forms? Sometimes people will say, well, they have the 6 opulences in full, right? I was discussing a bit of this last night. But Nrsingadev has all the 6 opulences in full. But why is he not normally listed as one? Because he's not too much of a Purush, right? He is in the sense that he's a personality, right? But, no matter how much you let loose, no matter how much you just don't care about maintaining your body, you're not going to wake up half lion. You know what I mean? And who's Nrsingadev's mother? It's a pillar, right? I don't know about any of you, but at least for me, right? I wasn't born from a pillar, right? So that's why these forms, they have that human-like flair to their pastimes, right? That's why we find Ramchandra, that very human-like sweetness, right? He's born to a mother, right? Krishna, he's also born, right, like this, and then he has these sweet human-like pastimes. So that's why they're considered Purushottams, right? And in this, we shouldn't think that the Maryada of Ramchandra is not present in Krishna's pastimes, right? I mean, in one sense, they're definitely not, right? It's described the first time that Ramchandra, he saw Sita, right? He felt ashamed, right? Because he thought, I've fallen in love with this personality, but I'm not yet married to her, right? And we know that Krishna has no such inhibitions, right? Krishna, Ramchandra, he's thinking, I can never lie. I can never even think a wrong thought. And Krishna, he's stealing butter, right? Krishna, he's lying to everyone, right? Krishna, he's running around causing trouble for everyone, right? And what happens? Ramchandra, he accepts this terrible, terrible vow to say, I'm doing this to please my parents. And Krishna, he's constantly giving his parents headaches, right? We see this is a difference, right? But also we find it is also present. Because Balaram, he is the same as Krishna, right? He's the first expansion. I remember in Christian thought, they say the first expansion of God is the Son, right? Because they're thinking logically, it's a little bit speculative, right? So they think if the first expansion is an expansion, then when a one person expands into another, it's like a son, right? So they think Father then Son. That's why you'll hear Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They're the initial expansions, right? In Christian theology. So I was preaching to one of my friends, right? And he's more and more favorable to Krishna consciousness, right? But he still has this very Christian samskar because he had very strong training in Christian theology. And I still remember I was telling him, Balaram, he is the first expansion of Krishna. And then he said, oh, so he's like his son. And I was like, no, he's his brother. And then he said, oh, his brother. And he was like, oh, that's interesting. And then we kept on talking. And then anyway, so we were speaking. And then at one point he said, yeah, so Balaram, the younger brother of Krishna, right? Because he's still speculating this on. And I said, no, it's his older brother. And then he just stood there and he was like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. What's going on here? How can the expansion be the older brother? And I said, just you wait until you find out that Krishna has parents in their jivas. So yeah, he was completely having a little existential crisis hearing about this. But anyway, so Balaram, right? He, in many ways, he is identified, right, as Ram in a sense, right? Even in Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. What do we hear about the definition of the name Ram, right? Sometimes Prabhupada says it's Ramchandra, but like on Ram Navami feast, you know what I mean? Not as a general rule of thumb, right? When we're all in that mood of celebrating Ramchandra, then he will. But in general, we'll hear either as Balaram, or we'll also hear as Radharaman, right? The highest conception is that they're names of Krishna, right? But yes, so Balaram, He is the Maryada Purush. So we have all of that in Krishna's pastimes, right? When all the other gopas, sometimes when Krishna, right? We all know, when Krishna, he's eating mud, right? And all the other gopas, they go to Mother Jashoda, and they tell Mother Jashoda, Krishna, he's eating mud, right? They say this. Mother Jashoda, she thinks, sometimes they lie to get Krishna in trouble, right? And what does she do? She goes to Balaram, and she says, Balaram, is this true? Because Balaram will not lie, right? Balaram, he is that Maryada Purush. So we find all of that is there, right? There is variety, but all variety is satisfied in Krishna's pastimes, right? Aishvarya is there in Krishna's pastimes. It's just the Madhurya is so strong we can't even notice it, right? It's like, in comparison to Madhurya, Aishvarya is like medicine, right? Not to be offensive to Aishvarya. Aishvarya is very glorious, right? And we offer our full Dandavat pranams to all the devotees who are experiencing Aishvarya Bhav, but Madhurya is much higher, objectively speaking. In the same way, I don't know when you were little, but when I was little, whenever I'd get medicine, sometimes in order to convince me to eat it, my parents would cover it in sugar, right? And then I would think, oh, yay, I'm getting all this sugar, and little did I know, they got me, right? And then I took the medicine, right? In the same way, the Aishwarya is all there, right? But it's covered in the Madhurya. But everything is there, present in Krishna's pastimes. And that's why we can say, even though there's all of this variety in the spiritual world, it is not that I just like Krishna more, therefore Krishna is supreme. There is an objectivity to it as well, right? And then, of course, if one is attached to Aishwarya, the Madhurya becomes secondary. But we cannot accept that, right? I remember some disciples of Srila Prabhupada, they were going around South India, because Prabhupada, you can find there's room conversations where Prabhupada says, if you want to learn Brahminical culture, you go to South India, right? He even said, if you want to learn Vedic cosmology, you go to South India. So they went to South India and they were talking to the scholar in the Sri Vaishnav Sampradaya. And they were all speaking Hari Krishna Katha, right? And we all know how fun it is to speak and hear Krishna Katha. And they were all laughing and having fun. And he was speaking as well really beautifully from Bhagavatam, like this, how many generations Vaishnav family, right? So he's speaking, quoting all these shlokas, and these sannyas disciples of Srila Prabhupada, they're having so much fun. And then one of them says, I think it was Jagadguru Swami, he says, wow, he said, you have such great mood for Krishna. He said, and then he said, the thing about Narayan, and the moment he said Narayan, his face dropped. And he said, no, Narayan is a different thing. Old Aishwarya Bhav kicked in. And they all said that, reminded of Mahaprabhu traveling through South India. They thought how glorious, right? That mood comes out so strongly, right? Of course, that mood, again, we would not consider to be the highest mood, but we can definitely consider it a worshipable mood, right? That somebody can have that response on a gut level, right? Not second guessing that he can think, oh, my Lord Narayan, there is the Supreme Lord of the universe. I am his slave, right? Okay, so we find that. There's all the variety and all the diversity, but in the fullness, there's Krishna and Krishna's pastimes. I think, oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. Well, one in general, I can't speak of how you'd want to quantify it, but we do hear there's Viconta, right? And then at the very top of Viconta, there's Ayodhya, because that's where you're going to have your, you have Ayodhya because there's some human likeness to the relationships there. And then a little bit higher you have Dwarka, and then a little higher you have Goloka, and then there's everything else. But I think, how do I put it? There's also infinite Viconta planets, and there's also infinite material planets, right? I like to think of that 1/4 thing more as a ratio thing. It's not that if you counted them and divided them, then you would get to this number, right? So I wouldn't know. My understanding is because they're infinite, we can't really put a number on it, if that makes sense, but I could be wrong. That's just me piecing together. I like to think of it like prime numbers, right? There's infinite amount of numbers, right? We all know a prime number, right? It's a number that can only be divided by itself and 1. There's an infinite amount of numbers, and therefore there's an infinite amount of prime numbers, but there's more non-prime numbers than there are prime numbers. I don't know if that was too mathematical an analogy. If not, just don't worry about it. Just forget I ever said anything. But in that sense, right, there's both infinite, but even though they're both infinite, we can say there's more of one than the other. But I don't know any indication. There might be some shastra that says that, But my understanding is that we can't really put a number to the ratios within the spiritual world. But I could be wrong. Yeah.
Are the residents of Vrindavan around par with Mother Sita? That in the sense that nobody can touch them? Like, I mean, you're giving an example of, Brahma Vimohan Lila.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So you're talking about Sita Brahma.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are they on the same level?
Like the pure devotees who are having spiritual bodies, yeah. But I would hope that the sadhak dehas can be touched, otherwise I'm not getting any mercy. So yeah, my understanding is the sadhak deha can be touched of like a pure devotee. We hear about that, the purificatory power, but the what's it called? But yeah, the eternal forms are like that. They can't be snatched away, at least. Like the Vrijvasis never leave Vrindavan, right? Vrindavan manifests through Yogamaya, so that it's the same Golok of Vrindavan on earth, because they're never going to leave it, and they can't leave it, so you can't steal them away. So that's my understanding, yeah. So just quickly to clarify on that, they could theoretically leave, but it would be by Yogamaya. It wouldn't be through the potency of the person. It would be through Yogamaya's potency. And because Yogamaya is maintaining them always in Vraj, it would be kind of like the embassy sort of situation. Yeah. Sorry, what was the other thing? Yeah?
This is when someone was asking on the occasion of Sita Ramana yesterday.
Yeah.
If you go to places like Ayodhya, especially like yesterday,
Yeah.
they would actually consider Lord Ramachandra as a supreme personality of God.
Yeah.
And if you go to Vrindavan,
Yeah.